My father threw a massive backyard barbecue to celebrate kicking me out onto the street. I pulled my beat-up Honda Civic into the driveway of my childhood home in Atlanta to grab my final box of belongings, only to see a huge custom banner hanging proudly over the two-car garage. In bold red letters, it read, "Goodbye, Freeloader. Do not come back." My own sister threw a hot dog at my windshield, while her husband handed me a $20 bill for gas, telling me to stop dragging down the family legacy. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took a picture of their smiling faces under that banner, drove away, and made one phone call to my wealth manager to buy the commercial lease right out from under my father. Before I share exactly how I dismantled their fake perfect lives piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to teach toxic family members a lesson they will never forget. The thick Atlanta humidity hit me the second I opened my car door. The smell of hickory smoke and grilled ribs filled the air, mixing with the loud rhythm and blues music vibrating from my father's expensive outdoor speakers. Everyone was there. Aunts, cousins, neighbors from our local church congregation, all holding plastic red cups and laughing. They were not just having a family cookout, they were throwing an eviction party. For me. I kept my face completely blank as I walked up the concrete driveway. For 3 years I had lived in the unfinished damp basement of that house. To them, I was the ultimate family failure. A 32-year-old woman who sat in the dark, staring at a computer screen all day, while the rest of the family built their glamorous lives. They had no idea that I was not playing video games down there. I was writing complex cybersecurity algorithms, building a supply chain protection software that would soon change the entire industry. But in my family, if you were not showing off a luxury car or a designer handbag at Sunday church service, you were a nobody. My Uncle Tyrone spotted me first. He stumbled forward, sloshing his beer onto the paved driveway. He pointed a meaty finger right at my face. 32 years old and no career, he yelled over the music, making sure the neighbors could hear. "Your poor mother had to feed your lazy behind for 3 years. It is about time Jerome threw you out." I ignored him and continued toward the side door leading down to the basement. I just needed to grab my last box of hard drives and servers. But my older sister Jasmine blocked the path. She was wearing a pristine white sundress, holding a plate of food, and glaring at me with pure disgust. Jasmine was the golden child, a luxury real estate agent who spent more money than she earned just to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. "There is your last free meal, loser," Jasmine sneered. She actually threw a ketchup-covered hot dog right at my chest. It bounced off my faded shirt, leaving a bright red stain. "Hurry up and get your trash out of that basement. My husband wants to start bringing in contractors tomorrow to build his custom wine cellar. You have made this house smell like failure for way too long." My mother Yolanda stood a few feet away on the patio chatting with her wealthy church friends. She saw Jasmine throw the food at me. She saw the stain on my shirt. Instead of intervening, she simply turned her back, adjusting her expensive pearls and laughing at something one of her friends said. In her eyes, my eviction was a necessary cleansing away to remove the only embarrassing flaw in her otherwise perfect social circle. Before I could step around Jasmine, her husband Connor intercepted me. Connor was a venture capital director, a white man who loved to play the savior for our African-American family. He constantly showered my parents with promises of elevating them into the white corporate elite of Atlanta. He looked me up and down, a patronizing smile stretching across his face as he pulled a crisp $20 bill from his leather wallet. He held it out to me like I was a beggar on the street. "Gas money, Aaliyah," Connor said, his tone dripping with fake pity. "Go fill up that tragic Honda of yours and get out of here. Stop dragging down Jerome's legacy. He is about to merge his trucking routes with my venture capital firm. We are taking his company public. We do not need your dead weight lingering in the background and ruining the optics." My father Jerome stepped out from the patio holding a pair of grilling tongs. He puffed out his chest, completely enchanted by Connor's validation. "You heard the man," Jerome barked at me. "Connor is taking my logistics business to the next level. We are playing in the big leagues now. Grab your box of computer junk and do not ever come back asking for handouts." I looked at the $20 bill in Connor's outstretched hand. I looked at my father, a man so desperate for a seat at the elite corporate table that he was willing to publicly humiliate his own daughter to impress his son-in-law. I looked at Jasmine grinning maliciously under that massive, cruel banner. I reached out and took the $20 bill from Connor. "Thank you for the gas money, Connor," I said, my voice steady and dangerously calm. "I wish you all the best with your big merger." I walked down the basement stairs, picked up the single heavy cardboard box containing my encrypted servers, and walked back up. I did not say another word to any of them. I simply pulled out my phone, framed the perfect shot of the house, the laughing family, and that enormous goodbye banner, and snapped a picture. Jasmine rolled her eyes. "Go ahead and post it," she taunted. "Let everyone know you are finally out of our hair." I placed the box in the passenger seat of my Honda, started the sputtering engine, and drove away from the house I had grown up in. The moment I turned the corner out of their neighborhood, my demeanor shifted. The quiet, submissive basement dweller vanished. I connected my phone to the car Bluetooth system and dialed my primary wealth manager. The call connected on the first ring. "Good afternoon, Aaliyah," my manager said. "I assume you are calling about the transaction." "Did the buyout clear?" I asked, watching the suburban houses roll by. "Yes," he confirmed. "The tech conglomerate finalized the acquisition of your supply chain software an hour ago. $150 million has successfully been deposited into your private accounts. Congratulations." "Good," I replied, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I want you to initiate an immediate real estate acquisition. Locate the commercial lease for my father's trucking depot. Find the property owner and offer them 20% above market value in cash. I want to buy the land right out from under him, but make sure you process the purchase through my anonymous shell company Apex Holdings. I do not want him to know who his new landlord is until the time is right." "Consider it done," he said. I ended the call and tossed Connor's $20 bill onto the dashboard. My family thought they had finally discarded their weakest link, so they could rise to the top. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to their complete and utter destruction. The drive from the suffocating humidity of the suburbs to the sleek glass towers of Buckhead took exactly 40 minutes. I pulled my battered car into the underground garage of the most exclusive residential high-rise in Atlanta. The valet attendant smiled warmly and opened my door. "Welcome home, Miss Washington," he said, taking the keys to the vehicle I would probably never drive again. I stepped into the private elevator and swiped my security keycard. The doors glided shut, whisking me 50 stories above the city I was about to conquer. My penthouse spanned 6,000 square feet of white marble floor to ceiling windows and custom minimalist furniture. It was a $6 million fortress of solitude that my family had absolutely no idea existed. As I dropped my single cardboard box onto the massive kitchen island, my phone vibrated violently against the stone surface. The notifications were coming in rapid succession. I picked it up and tapped the screen. It was the Washington family group chat. They were still celebrating my departure. My mother, Yolanda, had sent the first message in the group. "Thank the Lord, the basement is finally cleared out. The negative energy is gone. Connor is bringing his top investors over for dinner tomorrow, and we simply could not have them knowing a grown woman was living in our cellar." I stared at her words. Yolanda cared about nothing more than her image among the wealthy ladies at our local church. She treated her family like props in a stage play designed to win the approval of people who secretly looked down on her. My sister Jasmine was quick to reply right after her. "I just hope she does not park that embarrassing car anywhere near my neighborhood. Do not text us for rent money when you are sleeping in the back seat, Aaliyah. You had 3 years to get a real job." I read the messages twice, letting their arrogance wash over me. A real job. I set the phone down and pulled a thick manila folder from the top of my cardboard box. It contained the original rental agreement my father Jerome had forced me to sign 3 years ago. I traced my finger over the faded ink. $1,500 a month. That was what my own father charged me to sleep on a mattress, surrounded by black mold-exposed water pipes and a concrete floor that flooded every time it rained in Georgia. He told me it was a lesson in financial responsibility. He said the real world does not give handouts to lazy people. While they sat upstairs eating catered dinners and hosting church socials to display their perfect upper-middle-class facade, I was downstairs eating dollar ramen noodles. But I was not lazy. I was awake for 20 hours a day, writing thousands of lines of code. I was building a decentralized supply chain security software that banks and logistics conglomerates were desperately trying to develop. My family thought I was a failure because I did not wear designer clothes or schmooze at country club brunches. They could not comprehend that true wealth is silent until it is ready to strike. I walked over to the paper shredder tucked in the corner of my living room and fed the basement lease agreement into the blades. The sound of the paper tearing into tiny strips was the most satisfying music I had heard all day. I watched the physical proof of my humiliation turn to dust. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a direct message from my father. "Do not think you can come crawling back when you get hungry, Aaliyah. Connor is about to make us rich. You missed the boat." I smiled at the screen. Connor, the golden son-in-law, the venture capitalist who treated my family like a charity project to boost his own corporate ego. I walked away from the kitchen and entered my private home office. 3 curved monitors woke up as I sat in the ergonomic leather chair. My fingers moved across the keyboard with muscle memory. It was time to see exactly how rich Connor was about to make my father. I logged into my encrypted private server. As a cybersecurity specialist, finding digital footprints was not just my job, it was my art. I accessed the public and semi-private financial filings for Connor's venture capital firm. He projected an image of absolute dominance, driving luxury cars and throwing around business jargon at family dinners to make Jerome feel like a titan of industry. But numbers do not have egos and numbers do not lie. Within 10 minutes, I breached the outer layers of his firm corporate structuring. I bypassed the standard public reports and dug into the secondary accounts. I scrolled through the digital ledgers, my eyes scanning the endless rows of red ink. Connor was not a financial genius. He was a sinking ship. His fund was massively overleveraged, drowning in $15 million of toxic debt from a series of failed tech startups he had blindly funded. He was hemorrhaging money and desperately trying to hide it from his own board of directors. But it was the next document I uncovered that made me stop breathing for a moment. I opened a digital collateral agreement signed just 2 weeks ago. Connor had managed to secure a final desperate lifeline loan from a predatory private equity group. To get that massive influx of cash, he needed heavy collateral. He needed physical, tangible assets to guarantee the loan. I zoomed in on the signature page of the digital contract. There was Connor's signature written in his usual arrogant scrawl. And right beside it was my father's signature. Jerome had blindly signed over the deeds and operating rights of his entire trucking company to serve as the collateral for Connor's high-interest loan. My father was so desperate for the validation of this smooth-talking financial director that he had literally bet his entire life work on a failing venture fund. He had handed over the keys to the kingdom just to feel like he was part of the elite corporate club. If Connor defaulted on this massive debt, the private equity group would instantly seize Jerome's trucks, his routes, his warehouses, and his entire legacy. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glowing monitors in the quiet isolation of my penthouse. They had kicked me out to impress the very man who was actively leading them to the slaughterhouse. I opened a new secure terminal and initiated a trace on the private equity group that held Connor's debt. I needed to know who held the leash so my wealth manager could buy that debt immediately. The trap was already set by their own greedy hands. All I had to do was close the jaws. The drive to the luxury dealership in my sputtering Honda felt like a victory lap I was finally ready to take. The air conditioning had died 2 years ago, and the transmission groaned heavily every time I shifted gears, but it had served its purpose for a very long time. It kept me completely under the radar while I built my empire in the dark. I pulled into the pristine parking lot of the most exclusive imported auto gallery in all of Atlanta. The valet attendant in his crisp uniform hesitated for a split second before approaching my rusted car. I handed him the keys and told him to park it in the back because I would absolutely not be driving it home today. The showroom floor was a sprawling expanse of polished white tiles, reflecting the gleaming metal of imported luxury vehicles. The air smelled of expensive leather and citrus room spray. I walked past a row of sleek sports cars toward the luxury sport utility vehicle section. I needed something secure, heavy, and entirely mine. Something that matched the new reality I had just created for myself. Before I could even approach a sales representative, a familiar shrill voice cut through the quiet hum of the dealership. I said I want the interior detailing in ivory, not beige. Do you know who my father is? He is Jerome Washington, and he is leasing this under the company account, so you need to make it happen right now. I froze in my tracks. Standing next to a pristine custom matte black Range Rover was my older sister Jasmine. She was wearing a designer silk blouse, tapping her manicured nails aggressively against the hood of the expensive vehicle. My mother, Yolanda, stood right beside her, holding a tiny lapdog in her designer tote bag, and nodding her head in agreement with every ridiculous demand. They were giving the young salesman absolute pure misery, treating him like a servant rather than a professional. I took a deep breath and continued walking toward the front desk. I had no intention of engaging with them today, but in a showroom this wide open, it was only a matter of time before they saw me. Jasmine spotted me first. Her eyes widened in genuine shock before morphing into that familiar expression of deep, condescending disgust. She nudged my mother and pointed loudly in my direction. The salesman turned to look at me with a confused expression. "What are you doing here, Aaliyah?" Jasmine laughed loudly, making sure everyone in the immediate vicinity could hear her mocking tone. "Are you here to clean the showroom floors? They do not give free samples to people who walk in off the street. You need to leave before you embarrass us again." Yolanda pulled her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose and glared at me. Her face twisted with profound embarrassment. She immediately turned away from me and flagged down the sales manager, who was already walking over to defuse the loud situation. "Excuse me, sir," Yolanda said, her tone dripping with unearned entitlement. "You need to call security and have this woman escorted off the premises immediately. She is a disturbed vagrant who has been harassing our family for years. We are trying to conduct high-level business here today, and we will not do it with this kind of trash loitering in your establishment." The manager looked at me, then looked at my faded jeans and plain cotton shirt. He clearly did not want to cause a scene, but he also did not want to lose a massive commission from a family claiming to buy a custom luxury vehicle. "Mom," he said to me cautiously, "I might have to ask you to leave if you are bothering our preferred clients." I did not raise my voice. I did not act out. I simply looked at the custom matte black Range Rover Jasmine was standing next to, claiming as her own. "Is this specific vehicle currently available for purchase?" I asked the manager calmly, keeping my hands resting in my pockets. Jasmine scoffed and crossed her arms over her chest. "Are you deaf? Or just incredibly stupid? I just said my father is financing it for me." "It is my car, Aaliyah. Go back to your damp basement. Oh wait, you do not have one anymore because we finally kicked you out." At that exact moment, the finance director of the dealership walked onto the showroom floor holding a digital tablet. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from side to side. He cleared his throat and approached Jasmine and Yolanda, interrupting their moment of triumph. "Miss Washington," the finance director said nervously, "there seems to be a significant issue with the application you submitted." Jasmine rolled her eyes heavily. "Obviously, your system is broken or you do not know how to do your job. Just run the company tax identification number again. Jerome Washington Logistics. It is a multi-million-dollar company." "We did run it again," the director replied, lowering his voice to preserve whatever dignity she had left. "The corporate accounts you provided are currently frozen. There is a hard hold from a private equity firm regarding a massive default notice. The bank has blocked all outgoing transactions. Furthermore, Miss Washington, we ran your personal credit as a secondary option to help you out. You have 4 maxed-out credit cards and a pending repossession on your current mortgage. We cannot approve this lease under any circumstances whatsoever." The silence that fell over the showroom was absolute and heavy. Yolanda gasped loudly, clutching her expensive tote bag tightly to her chest. Jasmine turned completely pale, her arrogant smirk vanishing instantly into a mask of pure panic. The facade of their immense wealth was cracking in real time right in the middle of a luxury dealership for everyone to see. "I am not a vagrant," I said, turning my attention back to the general manager who was watching the scene unfold in stunned silence. "And I am not here to finance anything today." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my solid metal black card. I held it out to the manager, keeping steady and unbroken eye contact with my sister. "I will take this exact custom Range Rover," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "I am purchasing it in full right now. You can run the card for the entire amount plus tax and title fees." The manager stared at the heavy black metal card resting in my open palm. It was an invitation-only account reserved exclusively for ultra-high net worth individuals. He recognized it immediately, and his entire posture changed from cautious authority to completely subservient respect. "Right away, miss," he said, taking the card with both hands as if it were a rare artifact. "I will have the paperwork drawn up in my private office immediately. Would you like a beverage while you wait in the VIP lounge?" "No, thank you," I said smoothly. "Just bring me the keys." Jasmine looked like she was going to be physically sick right there on the polished white tiles. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She had just been publicly humiliated by a brutal credit rejection, only to watch the sister she tormented buy her absolute dream car with a single swipe of a card. Yolanda grabbed Jasmine's arm, pulling her frantically toward the exit doors. "This is some kind of sick trick," Yolanda muttered, her voice shaking with a potent mix of rage and deep embarrassment. "Jerome is going to hear about this immediately." They hurried out of the glass doors, practically running to avoid the stares of the sales staff who had just witnessed their complete financial exposure. 15 minutes later, I sat in the manager's office and signed the final transfer documents. The manager handed me the heavy key fob with a respectful bow, thanking me for my business. I walked out to the showroom floor, unlocked my new vehicle, and climbed into the pristine ivory leather interior. I started the engine, feeling the deep, powerful purr of the motor vibrating through the steering wheel. I drove the custom Range Rover right out of the showroom doors, leaving my old beat-up Honda and my family's delusion of grandeur sitting in the dust behind me as I headed back to my penthouse. The drive back to my penthouse in the new custom Range Rover was completely silent. There was no rattling from a broken transmission and no exhaust fumes leaking through the floorboards. There was only the soft scent of fresh ivory leather and the smooth glide of a machine built for power. I handed the keys to the valet attendant at my building and took the private elevator up to the 50th floor. When I stepped into my living room, the floor-to-ceiling windows were casting long shadows across the white marble. I poured myself a glass of cold water and walked over to my desk. My encrypted servers were running quietly in the background, but one specific monitor was blinking with a persistent red notification. It was a security alert triggered from a localized network miles away. The alert was coming from the basement of my father's house. When Jerome forced me to pay $1,500 a month to live in his damp cellar, I had to set up my own isolated network to build my cybersecurity firm. I routed everything through layers of encryption, but I purposely left one dormant decoy drive connected to the main house router. It was a standard security measure to see if anyone ever tried to snoop on my activity. I sat down in my leather chair and opened the access logs. Someone was currently connected to the basement network and digging through the digital trash I had left behind. I traced the internal protocol address straight to the guest room upstairs. It was Connor. He was desperate. I had already seen his financial records and knew his venture capital firm was bleeding millions of dollars. He had remortgaged his entire life and staked my father's trucking company on a toxic loan. He needed a miracle to show his investors before they realized his fund was completely bankrupt. I watched in real time as his digital footprint moved through the decoy drive. He was blindly searching for anything of value. A few minutes later, he found a file folder labeled Logistics Optimization Alpha. He paused his search. I could almost see the greedy smile spreading across his face. The file contained a block of complex code. To an untrained eye, It looked like a highly advanced routing algorithm designed to maximize delivery efficiency for a trucking company. Connor assumed it was just some freelance project I had abandoned when I was kicked out of the basement. He thought he had just stumbled upon a free piece of technology that could save his failing firm. I watched the progress bar on my screen as Connor downloaded the entire folder to his personal laptop. He took the bait. 3 days later, a new alert popped up on my screen. This time, it was from the United States Patent and Trademark Office database. My tracking software notified me that a new intellectual property registration had just been filed. I pulled up the public document. Connor had registered the stolen code under his own shell company. He actually had the sheer arrogance to claim my work as his own personal creation. I picked up my phone and opened the smart home application. Years ago, my father Jerome had complained that he could not figure out how to set up the voice-activated speakers he bought for the dining room. I had set them up for him and linked them to my master administrative account. I never logged out. I tapped the microphone icon on my screen and connected to the dining room device. A live audio feed instantly filled my quiet penthouse. I could hear the clinking of expensive silverware against china plates. I could hear wine being poured into crystal glasses. My mother Yolanda was laughing her usual loud and performative laugh. They were having a family dinner to celebrate Connor's supposed new victory. Connor tapped his glass and the room grew quiet. He announced that he had just acquired a revolutionary logistics algorithm for his venture capital firm. He told my father that his team of offshore developers had been working on it for months in secret. He claimed this software would streamline the entire supply chain industry and bring millions of dollars in new investment money to their doorstep. Jerome sounded like he was going to cry with joy. He told Connor that he was the absolute genius of the family. My father praised him endlessly, saying this was exactly why he merged his trucking roots with Connor's firm. Jerome proudly declared that they were finally going to be part of the elite corporate upper class of Atlanta. My sister Jasmine chimed in with her usual toxic energy. She said she was so glad they had finally gotten rid of the dead weight in the basement. She complained about the incident at the luxury car dealership, spinning a wild lie to protect her ego. Jasmine told my parents that I must have stolen a credit card or found a desperate man to buy me that Range Rover. Yolanda quickly agreed, stating that I would probably end up in a federal prison by the end of the year and bring shame to their church congregation. Connor laughed a rich, arrogant sound. He told them not to worry about me anymore. He promised Jerome that top tech investors were lining up to buy this new software he had created. He said their financial worries were permanently over. I sat back in my chair and listened to them toast to their brilliant future. I let the audio run as I pulled up the true source code on my central monitor. Connor was not a programmer, and his greed had blinded his judgment. The code he stole from that basement drive was not a logistics application. It was a highly sophisticated digital honeypot. I had designed it specifically as a security trap to track, trace, and audit unauthorized breaches. When I sold my cybersecurity company last week for $150 million, that specific block of code was included in the sale. It officially became the exclusive proprietary property of the massive global tech conglomerate that bought me out. By stealing that code and legally registering it under his own name with the federal government, Connor did not just steal a project from his sister-in-law. He had just committed documented federal corporate espionage against one of the most powerful and heavily monitored technology corporations in the world. And he had tied his investors and my father's trucking company directly to the crime. The trap was now permanently locked. Sunday morning arrived with the bright, blinding sunlight typical of a late Georgia summer. I dressed carefully for the occasion, selecting a tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect without screaming for attention. I drove my new custom matte black Range Rover through the quiet morning streets, pulling into the sprawling paved lot of the most prominent African-American church in Atlanta. This was the epicenter of my parents' social universe. It was a place where faith was often overshadowed by the relentless display of wealth, designer hats, and luxury vehicles. I parked my flawless new car right near the entrance, knowing perfectly well that my sister would recognize the exact vehicle she had been publicly humiliated over just days prior. The air was thick with expensive perfume and the low hum of hundreds of congregants settling into their wooden pews as I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary. I slipped into a seat near the middle of the room, keeping my presence quiet. Up at the main podium, my mother Yolanda was adjusting her microphone. She was wearing a vibrant lavender dress and a matching wide-brimmed hat, completely in her element as the chairperson of the church planning committee. She leaned forward and began her prepared speech about the blessings of family and the importance of raising successful God-fearing children. She smiled radiantly and pointed directly toward the front row, where my father Jerome, my sister Jasmine, and her husband Connor were sitting in their finest clothes. Yolanda spoke about the rewards of hard work, proudly mentioning Jerome and Connor's upcoming corporate merger as proof of God's favor upon their righteous household. She praised Jasmine as a beacon of grace, completely ignoring the fact that her golden daughter had a pending repossession on her home and maxed out credit cards. The congregation murmured in polite agreement, completely fooled by the flawless illusion my family projected. I sat silently in my pew watching the performance. But my peace did not last long. My father Jerome turned his head to scan the crowd, and his eyes locked onto mine. His posture stiffened immediately. The smug pride on his face vanished, replaced by a dark, stormy anger. He whispered something to my uncle Tyrone, who was sitting beside him. Within seconds, both men stood up and navigated through the crowded aisle, marching directly toward my pew. Jerome leaned heavily over the wooden back of the pew in front of me, his face flushed with rage. "What are you doing here, Aaliyah?" He hissed, his voice low and threatening, so the surrounding families would not hear. "I told you never to come back and embarrass us. We are respected members of this congregation, and you are sitting here looking like a ghost from the basement. Get up and leave before you ruin your mother's moment." Before I could respond, Uncle Tyrone shoved his way next to my father. He glared down at me with absolute contempt. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here like a stray dog begging for scraps," Tyrone muttered, crossing his thick arms. "You do not belong here anymore. Go back to whatever hole you crawled into and let Jerome and Connor handle the real business." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with either of them. I simply folded my hands in my lap and smiled a very small, entirely cold smile. "I am just here for the service," I replied calmly. "I would hate to miss the pastor's special announcement." Jerome scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. He turned to walk back to the front row, muttering about my sheer audacity, while Tyrone shot me one last warning glare. They took their seats just as Yolanda finished her speech to a round of warm applause, returning to her place beside Jerome, looking incredibly pleased with herself. The senior pastor stepped up to the podium. He was an older man with a booming voice that commanded absolute silence in the massive room. He adjusted his glasses and looked out over the congregation with a solemn expression. "Brothers and sisters," the pastor began, his voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. "For the past 5 years, this church has struggled under the crushing weight of a $2 million mortgage. We have prayed and fasted, asking for a miracle to save our sanctuary from the bank." The congregation grew entirely silent. Everyone knew about the financial troubles of the church. Jerome and Yolanda frequently used the church debt as a talking point, claiming they would eventually contribute a massive sum once their logistics merger was complete. It was just another piece of their fake philanthropy. Yesterday afternoon, the pastor continued wiping a single tear from his cheek. I received a phone call from our bank. An anonymous donor operating through a corporate entity called Apex Holdings has wired the exact funds to our account. The entire $2 million mortgage has been paid in full. We owe absolutely nothing to the bank as of this morning. A collective gasp echoed through the sanctuary, followed by a wave of joyful murmurs and quiet prayers. I watched my parents in the front row. Jerome puffed out his chest, looking around the room to see who this mysterious billionaire might be, clearly wishing it was him. Jasmine and Connor leaned in to whisper to each other, no doubt speculating on which local sports star or celebrity had made the donation. The pastor raised his hands to quiet the room. The executives at Apex Holdings requested that their donation remain largely anonymous, but they informed me that a local representative of their company would be in attendance this morning, the pastor said, scanning the sea of faces. If the representative for Apex Holdings is here today, would you please stand so this congregation can extend our deepest gratitude? The room was completely still. Every head turned looking to see which wealthy Atlanta elite would stand up to claim the glory. I uncrossed my legs, I smoothed the fabric of my charcoal suit and slowly stood up from my pew. For a few seconds, no one seemed to comprehend what was happening. Then the pastor looked directly at me, his eyes widening in recognition as he recalled the name on the legal documents. He smiled warmly and nodded his head toward me. My father Jerome turned around in his front row seat to see who had stood up. When his eyes landed on me, his jaw physically dropped open. The color drained from his face so fast he looked completely ill. Beside him, Yolanda turned and let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Jasmine and Connor stared at me in absolute paralyzed shock. The sister they had thrown a hot dog at the woman they had evicted from a damp basement. The stray dog they had just told to leave the church was standing tall as the representative of the multi-million-dollar holding company that just bought their sanctuary. I looked directly at Jerome and offered him a polite, respectful nod. I did not say a word. I did not need to. The silence in the room was deafening, and the look of total helpless terror on my father's face was the only sermon I needed to hear. I did not wait for the service to officially conclude. As the choir began their final hymn, I turned and walked quietly down the center aisle of the sanctuary. I could feel the burning gazes of my family tracking my every movement, but I kept my head held high and pushed through the heavy oak doors into the sweltering heat of the Sunday afternoon. I just wanted to get into my Range Rover and drive back to my penthouse. I had delivered my message, and the absolute shock on their faces was all the closure I thought I needed. But my family was never one to let sleeping dogs lie. Before I could even unlock my car, I heard the aggressive clatter of heels on the pavement behind me. "Aaliyah, wait right there." I turned around slowly, leaning against the sleek black hood of my vehicle. The entire Washington family was marching across the parking lot toward me, looking like a poorly dressed mob. Jerome was leading the pack, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. Yolanda was struggling to keep up in her lavender dress, while Jasmine and Connor flanked them like angry bodyguards. They did not look apologetic. They did not look humbled. They looked furious that their carefully constructed reality had just been publicly shattered. Jasmine reached me first, pointing an acrylic nail directly at my face. "Who are you sleeping with?" she screamed, her voice shrill enough to turn the heads of the few churchgoers lingering in the parking lot. "You think you can just waltz in here and play the big shot? What are you, an escort now? Is some rich old man funding this little stunt of yours?" I looked at my sister, letting her desperate insecurity wash over me. She was so consumed by her own failing image that her brain could not physically process the idea of my independent success. Connor stepped in front of Jasmine, placing a restraining hand on her shoulder. He let out a loud, patronizing laugh, shaking his head as he looked at my charcoal suit and the expensive vehicle behind me. "Calm down, Jasmine." Connor said, a smug grin returning to his face as he desperately tried to rationalize what had just happened. "Do not give her so much credit. She is not sleeping with anybody rich. Apex Holdings is a massive corporate entity. They probably just hired her as a low-level assistant or a glorified secretary to drop off the paperwork. They send the nobodies to do the heavy lifting, while the real executives stay in the office. You are just a messenger, Aaliyah, playing dress-up in a company car." Yolanda nodded vigorously, clinging to Connor's ridiculous explanation like a life raft. Of course, she agreed, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat. "She is just a stand-in. How dare you try to take the glory in front of our pastor, Aaliyah? You deliberately tried to humiliate your father and me." Jerome pushed his way to the front of the group, completely ignoring his wife and son-in-law. He did not care if I was an executive or a secretary. He only saw dollar signs and an opportunity to save his own sinking ship. He planted himself inches from my face, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. "I do not care what your job title is," Jerome barked at me, his eyes wide with wild desperation. If you have access to the accounts at Apex Holdings, you need to reroute that church money immediately. You are going to cancel that donation and funnel those funds directly into my logistics company. Connor has investors breathing down our necks, and we need liquid capital right now. Right. I stared at him, completely unfazed by his aggressive posture. You want me to steal $2 million from a church to save your failing trucking business? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. It is not stealing. It is an investment in your bloodline, Jerome yelled, slamming his hand down on the hood of my Range Rover. You owe me, Aaliyah. You lived under my roof. I put clothes on your back. You owe me for 18 years of food and shelter. You are going to fix my company, or I will call your bosses at Apex Holdings and tell them you are an unstable thief who stole from her own family. Connor crossed his arms, nodding in agreement. You heard him, Aaliyah. Be a good little assistant and wire the money to my venture fund. We will make sure your father gets his cut. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. The chaotic screaming and demanding noise of my toxic family faded into the background. I pulled out a crisp, thick white envelope and held it out directly toward my father. Jerome snatched it from my hand, tearing the flap open with greedy anticipation. He probably thought it was a corporate check or a direct deposit form. I watched in total silence as he unfolded the heavy legal document. His eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page, and his aggressive breathing suddenly stopped. The deep crimson color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and completely hollow. What is this? Yolanda asked, peering over his shoulder. I stood up straight and looked my father dead in the eyes. I do not owe you anything, Jerome, I said, my voice slicing through the thick Georgia humidity like a razor. But you owe my company $40,000 for your trucking depot's commercial lease rent. Jasmine gasped, taking a step back. What are you talking about? She stammered. I smiled, letting the reality of their destruction finally set in. I am the sole owner of Apex Holdings, I explained, watching Connor's smug grin vanish into absolute horror. I bought the land out from under your logistics depot 3 weeks ago. You are currently 30 days delinquent on your new adjusted lease. That is an official eviction notice. The $40,000 is due in full by Friday. If the funds are not in my account by close of business, I am seizing your trucks, your routes, and every single asset on that property. I turned around, opened the door to my car, and climbed into the driver's seat. I did not look back as I started the engine and drove out of the church parking lot, leaving them standing in the blistering heat, holding the exact instrument of their financial ruin. The drive back to my office was incredibly peaceful. I knew leaving Jerome holding that eviction notice in the sweltering church parking lot would trigger a massive wave of panic within the family. But I also knew exactly how they would react. They would never accept defeat. Instead, they would look to Connor and his stolen intellectual property as their ultimate salvation. Connor had spent the entire week believing he was a genius. He had taken the dummy code he stole from my decoy drive. The code that was actually a highly restricted digital honeypot I had sold to a massive tech conglomerate and packaged it as his own revolutionary logistics algorithm. He truly believed this stolen software would optimize Jerome's failing trucking routes and bring in millions of dollars from desperate tech investors, saving his own bankrupt venture capital firm in the process. By Wednesday afternoon, my phone vibrated on the sleek glass desk of my new executive office. I had intentionally remained in the Washington family group chat, keeping a quiet eye on their endless cycle of delusion. A new message popped up from Connor. It read, "Just secured a massive deal with the top tech executives in the city. The pitch is today. Jerome, your trucking company is saved. We are about to lock in an 8-figure buyout." The chat immediately exploded with notifications. Yolanda sent a barrage of champagne and heart emojis praising Connor for being the savior of the Washington legacy. Jerome replied that he was going to start looking at new vacation homes in the Hamptons, claiming he always knew merging with Connor's firm was a masterstroke of business genius. They were already spending the money in their minds, completely blinded by greed. Then my phone buzzed with a direct message from my sister Jasmine. She could not resist the urge to rub her husband's imaginary victory in my face. Her text read, "See, this is what white excellence looks like. Connor just saved the entire family with his own brilliance. You might have scammed your way into buying that church building, but you are still just a nobody playing with other people's money. Connor is a real executive, and he is about to make us richer than you could ever dream." I read her pathetic message and set my phone face down on the polished mahogany table. I did not bother replying. There was absolutely no need to. I was currently sitting at the head of a massive oval glass table in the executive boardroom on the 50th floor of the city's most prestigious corporate tower. This building was the global headquarters for the exact tech conglomerate that had recently purchased my cybersecurity firm for $150 million. As part of my buyout agreement, they had appointed me as their chief technology officer. My new role gave me absolute authority over evaluating and approving any new software acquisitions the company made. Connor had spent days desperately reaching out to the top investment divisions in the city, begging for a meeting to sell his supposedly groundbreaking logistics software. The acquisitions team had flagged his proposal and sent it directly to my desk because the code he submitted in his preliminary pitch packet perfectly matched the proprietary honeypot software our company already legally owned. I folded my hands and waited in the silent, air-conditioned room. My legal team and the corporate fraud investigators were stationed in the adjacent viewing room, listening through the internal audio feed. The heavy wooden doors at the end of the boardroom slowly pushed open. Connor walked in wearing a pristine navy blue suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase, holding his head high with that familiar, arrogant swagger. He expected to walk into a room full of gullible corporate investors, eager to hand him a blank check. He smoothed his tie and put on his most charming business smile, ready to deliver the pitch of his life. He stepped fully into the room and turned toward the head of the table. His confident stride completely stopped. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His briefcase slipped from his fingers, hitting the carpeted floor with a dull thud. I leaned back in my leather executive chair and smiled at him. I was the only tech executive sitting in the room evaluating his pitch. Connor stood frozen in the doorway, staring at me, with his mouth slightly open. He blinked several times as if trying to clear a hallucination from his vision. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating, but then that familiar arrogant smirk crept back onto his face. He actually let out a loud, forced laugh, shaking his head as he looked around the massive boardroom. He turned to the security guard standing outside the heavy wooden doors and pointed a finger at me. He told the guard that there had been a massive security breach. He claimed I was his wife's troubled sister, who had a history of mental instability and corporate stalking. He demanded that the guards remove me from the building immediately so he could conduct his multi-million-dollar presentation with the real executives. The security guard did not move a single muscle. Instead, the door to the adjoining viewing room opened, and Richard, the chief executive officer of the global tech conglomerate, stepped out. Richard was a man who commanded absolute respect in the industry, and Connor instantly recognized him from countless financial magazines. Connor rushed forward, extending his hand to greet the billionaire, but Richard ignored him completely. Richard walked straight over to my chair and stood beside me, placing a respectful hand on the glass table. He looked at Connor with absolute disgust. Richard informed Connor that there would be no security removal today. He formally introduced me to my brother-in-law. He announced that I was the new chief technology officer and the newest majority shareholder of the entire parent company. I watched Connor's extended hand drop slowly back to his side. The smug arrogance melted off his face, leaving nothing but raw, panicked realization. His legs actually trembled as he was forced to pull out a chair and sit down opposite me. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the inevitable blast. He was completely trapped. I reached over and tapped a single button on my glass console. The massive screen behind me flickered to life, illuminating the dark boardroom with thousands of lines of complex green code. It was the exact software folder Connor had stolen from the basement decoy drive. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I looked him dead in the eyes and asked him to explain his revolutionary product to us. I asked Mr. Connor to explain to the board exactly why the groundbreaking logistics code he was trying to sell us contained my personal digital signature embedded directly into the core framework. Connor opened his mouth to speak, but only a pathetic stammer came out. The color drained from his face as he realized he had walked straight into a federal trap. Before he could formulate a lie, I tapped the console again. The screen shifted from the software code to display a series of highly classified financial ledgers. I asked him to explain why the hidden tracking malware attached to that stolen code had just spent the last 3 days quietly auditing his venture capital firm's illegal offshore slush funds. Connor sat completely frozen in his expensive leather chair, while the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom illuminated the beads of sweat rapidly forming on his forehead. He tugged at his silk tie as if the fabric was suddenly choking him. The confident swagger he had carried into the room had completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate man staring at his own financial ruin projected on a 50-foot screen. He looked around the massive room, searching for an ally, but Richard and the rest of the board simply watched him with cold, professional detachment. He swallowed hard and tried to force a chuckle, a nervous, hollow sound that echoed painfully in the silent room. "Aaliyah let us keep family matters out of this," he said, his voice dripping with that familiar condescending tone he had used on me for years. "We are all professionals here, and there is no need to make a scene over a simple misunderstanding between relatives. I was just testing the software to see if it was viable for your new company." I did not smile, and I did not break eye contact. I simply pushed a thick manila folder across the polished glass table until it rested right in front of his trembling hands. "There is absolutely no misunderstanding, Mr. Connor," I replied, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "What we have here is documented proof of federal corporate espionage. You broke into a secured local network, downloaded proprietary software belonging to this corporation, and attempted to sell it back to us for your own personal profit. And unfortunately for you, the tracking malware embedded in that code did not just audit your illegal slush funds, it also triggered an automatic legal protocol." Connor's eyes darted wildly across the documents in the folder. His breathing became shallow and rapid as he read the bold legal print. It was a federal injunction. I leaned back in my chair and watched him realize the true magnitude of his mistake. "I am not just rejecting your pathetic pitch, Connor," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "As of 10 minutes ago, my legal team filed that injunction with the federal courts. Your venture capital firm is officially under investigation for corporate espionage and wire fraud. Every single asset attached to your company, your bank accounts, your properties, and your investment portfolios has been completely frozen." He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. The millions of dollars he had promised his investors and the empire he had built on a foundation of lies and theft, it was all gone in an instant. He had walked directly into my trap and handed me the exact tools I needed to dismantle his entire life. He could not blame a bad market or a failed investment. He had committed a federal crime on corporate cameras. Richard gave a subtle nod to the security team waiting by the door. Two large men in dark suits stepped forward and took their positions on either side of Connor's chair. "It is time for you to leave, Mr. Connor," Richard said, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. "Our legal department will be in contact with your representation shortly." The security guards grabbed Connor by the arms and hauled him to his feet. His expensive leather briefcase was left abandoned on the carpet. The polished executive persona was entirely shattered, replacing the golden boy with a panicked, desperate criminal being forcibly removed from the building. He thrashed against their grip, his polished shoes scraping against the floorboards. As they dragged him toward the heavy wooden doors, Connor twisted around to look at me. His face was twisted in an ugly mask of pure rage. "You are going to pay for this, Aaliyah!" he screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You think you can just destroy my life and walk away? The family is going to crush you, and Jerome will not let you get away with this. I picked up my tablet from the table and looked at the blinking notification on the screen. The final phase of my plan had just been successfully executed. I looked up at Connor as the security guards pulled him through the doorway. "Tell Jerome to check his bank accounts," I replied. The silence in the boardroom after Connor was dragged away felt incredibly peaceful. The federal freeze on his assets took less than an hour to hit the financial news networks. The ripple effect of my injunction was immediate and devastating. Connor's venture capital firm was not just a standalone entity, it was the primary financial backer for my sister Jasmine's luxury real estate brokerage. For years, she had flaunted her success, claiming she was a self-made mogul who understood the housing market better than anyone. The truth was, she had been floating on Connor's stolen money, playing businesswoman with funds that were never clean to begin with. By Friday morning, the federal audit had completely engulfed Jasmine's operations. Her brokerage accounts were flagged and frozen pending the corporate espionage investigation. Her ongoing escrow accounts were locked. Her luxury listings were seized. The golden child of the Washington family who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate her own status was now drowning in a federal financial investigation. I was sitting in the quiet serenity of my new penthouse apartment later that evening, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering city skyline. My sanctuary was entirely private, unlisted, and heavily guarded. That was why the sudden aggressive pounding on my front door was such a surprise. I walked over to the security monitor and checked the camera feed. Jasmine was standing in the hallway looking absolutely deranged. Her usually perfect hair was a frizzy mess, and her designer makeup was smeared under her eyes. She had tracked me down. She later screamed that she had drained her last accessible personal checking account to bribe a private investigator to find my unlisted address. She had manipulated a delivery driver to tailgate her way past the lobby security desk just to get to my floor. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the heavy oak door open. Jasmine did not even wait for an invitation. She barged past me into the foyer, radiating pure frantic rage. She looked around my luxurious penthouse, her eyes darting across the custom artwork and imported furniture. The sight of my success seemed to push her completely over the edge. She started screaming at the top of her lungs. She called me a monster, a jealous, bitter outcast who was trying to destroy the only successful people in the family. She demanded that I call my lawyers right that second and drop the injunction against Connor. She shrieked that I needed to undo whatever digital trap I had set for him because her real estate business was being torn apart by federal auditors and her clients were abandoning her. I calmly closed the front door and leaned against it, simply watching her self-destruct. I did not say a word, which only made her angrier. She paced across my living room, wildly waving her arms. She screamed that Mom and Dad were right about me all along. She said I was nothing but a manipulative parasite trying to steal the family glory. In a sudden fit of blind rage, she grabbed a hand-blown glass vase from the console table and hurled it directly at the hardwood floor. It shattered into hundreds of jagged pieces, the loud crash echoing through the massive apartment. She stood there breathing heavily, pointing a shaking finger at me. She told me to fix it. She demanded I undo the damage before she lost everything she had worked for. I looked down at the shattered glass by my feet and then looked back up at the terrified, frantic woman who used to make my childhood a living nightmare. I slowly walked past her, stepping carefully around the broken glass and moved toward the kitchen island. I picked up a sleek black tablet, swiped the screen to unlock it, and turned around to face her. I told her she was entirely missing the point. I explained that I could not undo the federal freeze even if I wanted to because Connor had committed a severe corporate crime. But more importantly, I told her that she was directing her anger at the wrong person. I walked over and handed her the tablet. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely hold the device. I told her to look closely at the highlighted bank statements on the screen. I explained that the tracking malware embedded in my code had captured a complete snapshot of Connor's financial history just before the accounts were locked. I watched her eyes scan the documents. I watched her pupils dilate as the reality of the numbers finally processed in her brain. I spoke softly, keeping my voice perfectly level. I told her that Connor did not just lose his own venture capital money. I explained that his firm had been bleeding cash for months, and in a desperate attempt to cover his failing investments, he had forged her signature. He had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on her pristine $1 million suburban home to fund his slush accounts. Those accounts were now seized by the federal government. Jasmine let out a choked, gasping sound. The tablet slipped from her hands and landed on the plush rug. I looked her dead in the eyes and told her the absolute truth. Connor had not just ruined his career, he had gambled away her sanctuary. She was officially homeless. Jasmine remained on my floor, weeping into the plush rug as the reality of her ruined life finally set in. She looked up at me with mascara running down her cheeks, expecting me to show some kind of sisterly compassion. Instead, I simply walked over to the kitchen island, poured myself another glass of water, and called my private security to escort her out of the building. I did not feel an ounce of pity. She had spent her entire life trying to destroy my confidence, and now her own greed had destroyed her future. The very next week, the dominoes began to fall exactly as I had calculated. Week 2 of my plan initiated the total collapse of Jerome's precious trucking company. For months, he had been relying on the delusion that Connor's venture capital firm would swoop in with an 8-figure buyout. He had over-leveraged his business, ignored his debts, and bought luxury cars on company credit, all because he thought a massive tech deal was guaranteed. But with Connor's assets completely frozen by federal investigators, that imaginary money vanished into thin air. Monday morning hit Jerome like a freight train. His corporate bank accounts went into the negative. Without the promised cash injection, he could not make payroll. His veteran drivers, furious over missing paychecks, staged an immediate walkout, refusing to turn the ignition keys until they saw their money. Hours later, his corporate fuel accounts were completely suspended for non-payment. His entire fleet of commercial trucks was grounded, sitting uselessly in the massive gravel depot yard, while furious clients flooded his business lines, demanding to know why their freight was not moving. By Wednesday afternoon, the panic had reached a fever pitch. Jerome called a mandatory emergency family meeting at my parents' house. I was not invited, of course, but I did not need a formal invitation to know exactly what was happening inside that house. I still had administrative access to the interior security cameras I had purchased and installed for them years ago, back when I was still playing the role of the dutiful daughter. I sat at my sleek office desk, pulled up the live video feed on my laptop, and watched the glorious destruction unfold in high definition. The living room looked like a war zone. The flawless Washington family unity had completely disintegrated into a pack of starving wolves turning on their own. Jerome was pacing back and forth across the expensive carpet, his face flushed red with absolute desperation. Jasmine and Connor were sitting in the corner looking like empty ghosts, completely shell-shocked from their own federal financial ruin. My mother was sobbing dramatically on the sofa, clutching a tissue and moaning about the family reputation. Jerome immediately zeroed in on Uncle Tyrone, backing him into the corner by the fireplace. Jerome was practically foaming at the mouth, aggressively demanding that Tyrone liquidate his retirement portfolios to give him an emergency loan to save the trucking fleet. He tried to bully Tyrone using the exact same intimidation tactics he had always used on me. He yelled that family meant sacrificing for the greater good, and that Tyrone owed it to the Washington legacy to write him a massive check right that second. But Tyrone was a cautious man who had spent 40 years protecting his own savings. He looked at Jerome's failing business and Connor's frozen assets and flatly refused to hand over a single dime. Jerome absolutely exploded. He started screaming, calling Tyrone a traitor and a coward. That was the breaking point for everyone else in the room. The tension snapped and the family turned on each other in a vicious screaming match. Jasmine stood up and started blaming Jerome for trusting Connor in the first place, screaming that if Jerome had a real business, her husband would not be under federal investigation. Connor snapped back, blaming Jerome for having a bankrupt trucking company that forced him to steal the code to begin with. My mother tried to intervene and ended up getting yelled at by all three of them. Decades of fake loyalty and unconditional love were ripped apart in minutes as they fought like rats over a sinking ship. Right in the middle of their screaming match, the doorbell rang. The sudden noise silenced the room. Jerome stormed over to the entryway and yanked the front door open. A courier was standing on the porch holding a thick, certified envelope requiring a direct signature. Jerome snatched the clipboard, scrawled his name aggressively, and ripped the envelope open right there in the hallway. He probably expected it to be a lifeline or a delayed check from a sympathetic client. I watched through the camera feed as his eyes scanned the formal letterhead. His hands began to shake violently. The color drained from his face, matching the exact shade of sheer terror Connor had worn in my boardroom just days prior. He stumbled backward, his shoulder hitting the wall as the pages slipped from his trembling fingers and scattered across the floor. The certified notice was from Apex Holdings, the massive corporate real estate entity that owned the sprawling land his trucking depot sat on. It was a formal and immediate termination of his commercial lease, citing a gross breach of contract and severe financial delinquency. The letter explicitly stated that the locks on the depot gates were being changed that afternoon and demanded he vacate the premises immediately. Jerome had no money, he had no drivers, and now he had absolutely nowhere to park his trucks. The news of Jerome's total ruin spread through the family like wildfire. It did not take long for them to connect the dots. The federal freeze on Connor's venture capital firm, the sudden eviction from Apex Holdings, and my sudden elevation to chief technology officer of the conglomerate that owned all of it created a very clear picture. The realization hit my mother Yolanda the hardest. The daughter she had thrown away, the one she had allowed to be humiliated and discarded, was now the only person holding the keys to their survival. By Friday morning, the receptionist at my executive suite buzzed my intercom. She sounded slightly confused as she announced that my mother was waiting in the lobby, holding a freshly baked peach cobbler. My mother had not baked anything from scratch since I was 12 years old. I took a deep breath and told the receptionist to let her up. The heavy glass doors to my office swung open, and Yolanda stepped inside. She was wearing her Sunday best, a tailored pastel suit, and an expression of manufactured maternal warmth that made my stomach turn. She walked across the plush carpet, cooing over the expansive city views and the sleek minimalist decor. She set the warm pie dish on my desk, treating my high-security executive office like it was her own personal kitchen. She reached out, trying to grab my hands, but I smoothly pulled them back and folded them on my lap. She did not miss a beat. She launched into a sickeningly sweet monologue about how she had always known I was destined for absolute greatness. She actually looked me in the eyes and said that she let Jerome kick me out of the family home years ago because she knew I needed a push. She called it tough love. She claimed it broke her heart to see me struggle, but she knew it would turn me into a brilliant corporate leader. She was trying to rewrite decades of blatant neglect and emotional abuse into a twisted story of maternal sacrifice. She told me I was always her most special girl. Then came the inevitable pivot. The smile tightened on her face as she leaned closer. She brought up Jasmine. She painted a tragic picture of my sister sitting in a foreclosed home, sobbing over her frozen bank accounts and shattered luxury real estate business. She told me that the Washington family image was in absolute tatters and that the community was starting to gossip about their financial collapse. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of foreclosure notices and legal bills. She slid them across the glass desk toward me. She begged me to pay off Jasmine's massive debts and undo whatever I had done to Connor's accounts, simply to save the family reputation. She said I had made my point and proven my success, but now it was my duty as a Washington to protect my sister and restore their dignity. I stared at the stack of unpaid bills and then at the baked goods sitting next to my keyboard. I did not feel an ounce of the guilt she was trying so desperately to trigger. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out my digital tablet. I tapped a specific audio file and turned the volume all the way up. The crisp, clear audio from the luxury car dealership filled the quiet office. My mother's own voice echoed off the glass walls, demanding that the sales manager throw me out, calling me a disturbed vagrant and a pathetic outcast who was harassing her successful son-in-law. Her recorded voice sneered with absolute disgust as she told the staff I was a nobody who did not belong anywhere near her family. I let the recording play until the bitter end. The manufactured warmth instantly drained from Yolanda's face, leaving behind a pale mask of sheer panic. Her mouth opened and closed, but she could not find a single word to excuse what she had just heard. I reached across the desk and slid the cobbler right back until it bumped against her shaking manicured hands. "Take your pie, Yolanda," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and calm. "Security will show you out." Yolanda grabbed her designer handbag with shaking fingers and practically fled the room, her heels clicking erratically against the polished floorboards. She did not look back. The moment the heavy glass door sealed shut behind her, I instructed my assistant to permanently revoke her building access. The matriarch of the Washington family, who had spent decades manipulating and gaslighting me, had finally realized that her tears held absolutely no currency in my world. But while Yolanda was busy retreating in total humiliation, Jerome was spiraling into outright delusion. The default notice from Apex Holdings had backed my brother into a corner he could not bully his way out of. His trucking depot was officially locked down, and his drivers had abandoned him. Instead of facing reality and filing for bankruptcy like a rational businessman, Jerome decided to double down on his own ego. My surveillance software, which still monitored his corporate email accounts, flagged a ridiculous new expenditure. Jerome had maxed out his final corporate credit card to book the premier VIP dining room at an elite steakhouse downtown, one of the most notoriously expensive restaurants in the entire city. He had branded it as an exclusive client appreciation dinner, but the guest list told a completely different story. The only client he was trying to appreciate was the anonymous CEO of Apex Holdings. He had sent an incredibly desperate email to my holding company's generic legal department begging for a face-to-face meeting with the chief executive. He promised a lucrative proposal and a path forward for his lease. My legal team had forwarded the request to me, and I had simply instructed them to accept the invitation on behalf of the CEO without ever revealing my identity. To maintain his pathetic facade of success, Jerome had commanded the rest of the family to attend the dinner. He needed them to act as human props, to prove to this mysterious executive that the Washingtons were still a powerful, unified force. I arrived at the steakhouse exactly on time, but I did not walk through the main entrance. As the owner of the conglomerate that technically owned the building the restaurant leased, I was quietly escorted through the private executive entrance by the general manager himself. He led me to an adjoining observation suite, a small private enclave separated from Jerome's dining room by a tinted two-way architectural glass divider. I stood in the shadows nursing a glass of sparkling water and watched my family sweat. The tension in their private dining room was so thick it looked hard to breathe. Jerome was wearing his most expensive custom suit, but his collar was already soaked with nervous perspiration. He kept checking his heavy gold watch, bouncing his leg under the thick mahogany table with frantic energy. Jasmine and Connor sat across from him, looking like they had aged 10 years in a single week. Connor kept staring blankly at his empty plate, completely traumatized by his impending federal indictment, while Jasmine nervously shredded her linen napkin into tiny, meaningless pieces. Yolanda was seated at the head of the table, trying desperately to maintain her regal posture, but her eyes kept darting toward the heavy oak door. She had not told them about our little meeting in my office. She had not admitted that she had begged the daughter she threw away for financial salvation. They were all sitting there clinging to the desperate hope that this faceless corporate giant would walk in, drink their expensive wine, and magically erase their massive debts. Jerome snapped at the waiter to keep the champagne flowing clearly, trying to mask his terror with false bravado. He told Jasmine to sit up straight and ordered Connor to look like a successful venture capitalist, not a man about to go to federal prison. Connor let out a bitter, hollow laugh and told Jerome to shut up, muttering that none of this would be happening if Jerome's trucking company was not a massive black hole for money. Jerome slammed his fist on the table, causing the crystal glasses to rattle, and hissed that tonight was their only chance to survive, so they better play their parts perfectly. Watching them turn on each other in that opulent room surrounded by expensive food they could not afford to pay for was deeply satisfying. They had built their entire lives on looking down at me, and now they were trapped in a cage of their own making, terrified of the future. I checked the sleek watch on my wrist. It was time. I gave a subtle nod to the restaurant manager, who was standing respectfully by the door. He immediately walked out of the observation suite and entered Jerome's dining room. The sudden opening of the door made the entire Washington family jump in their seats. Jerome immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket and pasting on a painfully fake smile of absolute confidence. The manager cleared his throat, commanding the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet space, "the CEO of Apex Holdings has arrived." The heavy oak door slowly swung open. I stepped through the open doorway into the dim ambient light of the private dining room. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, sealing the five of us inside. For a split second, nobody moved. Jerome stared at me, his eyes wide with absolute confusion that rapidly mutated into sheer panic. He looked frantically over my shoulder, expecting to see a billionaire executive walking in behind me. When he realized I was entirely alone, his face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. "What are you doing here, Aaliyah?" He hissed, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. He darted a panicked glance toward the door, as if the imaginary CEO was waiting in the hallway. "Get out right now," he commanded. "This is a private business dinner, and you are going to ruin the most important meeting of my life. Security is going to drag you out of here if you do not turn around and leave immediately." My mother gasped, clutching her pearl necklace. "Aaliyah, please do not do this today," Yolanda begged, her voice trembling with that fake fragility she always weaponized. "Your brother is trying to save the family. Just go back to your little apartment and let us handle adult business." I did not blink, and I certainly did not turn around. I walked with slow, deliberate steps across the thick Persian rug. Jerome stepped into my path, trying to physically block me from approaching the table. "Are you deaf, Aaliyah?" he growled, leaning in so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "I said get out before the Apex CEO gets here." I simply sidestepped him gracefully, gliding past his rigid body. I walked directly to the empty leather chair at the absolute head of the long mahogany table, the seat that Jerome had desperately reserved for his financial savior. I pulled the chair out, sat down, and rested my hands on the pristine white tablecloth. Jasmine stared at me like I had lost my mind. Connor let out a scoff, shaking his head at what he assumed was just another pathetic cry for attention from the family outcast. "Get up!" Jerome shouted, abandoning his hushed whisper. His face was turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are sitting in the CEO's chair." I looked up at him, meeting his furious gaze with absolute chilling calm. "I know Jerome," I replied, my voice echoing smoothly against the wood-paneled walls. "I am the CEO of Apex Holdings, Jerome. I own the dirt your trucks park on." The silence that crashed down on the room was so absolute it felt heavy. Jerome stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, shaking his head. "You are out of your mind," he spat. "You are a pathetic little code monkey. Apex is a massive corporate conglomerate. You do not own anything." He turned toward the glass partition, looking for the restaurant manager. "Tell her to get out!" he yelled at the tinted glass. "Tell this crazy girl to leave my dining room." The manager, who had followed me in, simply bowed his head respectfully toward me. "Can I get you anything else, Miss Washington?" the manager asked, completely ignoring Jerome's outburst. I shook my head. "No, thank you. That will be all," I replied. The manager nodded and quietly exited the room, leaving my family drowning in their own shock. The color rapidly drained from Jerome's face as the reality of the manager's deference set in. His eyes darted from the closed door back to me. He slumped into his chair, the expensive custom suit suddenly looking like a straitjacket. "This is a trick," Connor suddenly interrupted, slamming his hand on the table. His arrogance was a desperate shield. "She is bluffing, Jerome. She probably hacked their network or bought a fake title online. She does not have the capital to buy out a commercial depot. She is just trying to scare you because she is jealous of our success." I slowly turned my attention to Connor. The man who had stolen my software, mortgaged my sister's house, and bankrupted the family, all while claiming to be a financial genius. I reached into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope bearing the distinct official crest of the federal government. I tossed it casually down the length of the long table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood and came to a dead stop exactly in front of Connor's plate. "I would not be talking about fake titles right now, Connor," I said, my tone dripping with icy precision. "Your legal representation was supposed to deliver those to you tomorrow morning, but I figured I would save them the courier fee. Go ahead and open it." Connor's hands shook uncontrollably as he tore the seal. He pulled out the thick stack of papers. The bold black text at the top of the first page read "Federal Indictment." The grand jury had officially returned a true bill on counts of corporate espionage, wire fraud, and grand larceny. "You are going to federal prison, Connor," I stated, watching the arrogant golden boy crumble into a pathetic, hyperventilating mess. "And Jasmine," I added, glancing at my sister who was now weeping silently into her hands. "Your house goes into foreclosure on Monday." I looked back at Jerome, the family patriarch, the man who had spent his entire life telling me I was a worthless disappointment. The man who was currently sitting at a dinner he could not afford trying to impress a phantom CEO to save a company that was already dead. "You have 48 hours to remove your trucks from my property, Jerome," I commanded. "After that, they will be impounded and sold to cover your unpaid lease. The family legacy is over." Jerome stared at me, and the reality of my words finally shattered his towering ego. The proud, arrogant man who had ruled our family through fear and financial manipulation began to physically crumble before my eyes. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down his forehead and soaked into the expensive collar of his custom suit. He tried to speak, but his voice was completely gone, leaving only a pathetic stuttering sound in the quiet dining room. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as he gasped for air. "Aaliyah!" He finally choked out, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "You cannot do this to me. I am your father. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe me respect." I felt absolutely nothing as he played his ultimate guilt card. I opened my leather briefcase one last time and pulled out a glossy 8x10 photograph. It was a picture I had saved for years, waiting for this exact moment. The image showed the front lawn of the family estate. Draped across the pristine front porch was a massive custom banner that read, "Goodbye, Freeloader," in bold red letters. It was the banner Jerome had proudly hung the day he kicked me out, with nothing but a garbage bag of my clothes. I slid the photograph slowly down the length of the table until it stopped right next to his shaking hands. "You threw a lavish party to celebrate my homelessness, Jerome," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and icy. "You invited the entire neighborhood to laugh at your own daughter being thrown out into the street." I leaned back in the CEO's chair and folded my hands. "Now I am throwing a private party to celebrate your absolute bankruptcy." The sound of a chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor broke the silence. Jasmine let out a feral scream of absolute rage. Her perfect socialite facade completely vanished as she grabbed her heavy crystal wine glass. She lunged across the table, her arm pulling back to hurl the expensive dark red wine directly at my face. She called me a monster and shrieked that I was destroying her perfect life. Before the glass could even leave her hand, the heavy oak doors behind me burst open. My private security team moved with terrifying speed and precision. Two massive men in dark tailored suits crossed the private dining room in a fraction of a second. One of them clamped his hand onto Jasmine's wrist, twisting it firmly downward and forcing her back into her seat, while the dark wine spilled harmlessly across the pristine white tablecloth. The other guard stepped directly behind Connor, pinning his shoulders down to the heavy leather chair the moment he tried to jump up. My family was totally trapped and entirely at my mercy. It had been exactly 3 weeks since the barbecue. 3 weeks since my father had stood on his manicured lawn holding a plastic cup of beer and laughed while his friends mocked my departure. 3 weeks since that red and white banner had declared me a freeloader. The contrast between that sunny afternoon and this dim, suffocating dining room was absolute. My security team maintained their iron grip on Jasmine and Connor, ensuring the physical threat was completely neutralized, but the psychological damage was already doing all the heavy lifting. Jerome stared at me from across the expanse of white linen and crystal glasses. His eyes were bloodshot and wild, darting rapidly around the room, as if searching for a hidden camera or a sudden escape route that did not exist. The realization that his empire was gone and that his most hated child was the architect of his destruction finally broke through his thick skull. The transformation was both horrifying and incredibly satisfying to watch. The proud, arrogant patriarch who demanded absolute obedience and commanded every room he entered simply dissolved. His knees buckled, giving out beneath the weight of his massive debts and his shattered pride. Jerome collapsed onto the floor, his expensive leather shoes sliding uselessly against the thick carpet. He fell straight to his knees right at the foot of the table. In our culture, a proud man falling to his knees before his child was the ultimate irreversible humiliation. It was a surrender so deep and so absolute that it erased every single ounce of authority he had ever claimed to possess. His breathing became a series of ragged, wet gasps. Heavy droplets of sweat rolled down his temples and soaked into his custom collar. "Please, Aaliyah," he stammered, his voice shaking with a pathetic, desperate vibrato. "Please, you cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. I will lose the trucks. I will lose the house. Your mother will not survive the shame." He actually reached out, trying to grab the hem of my suit jacket, but my guard took a single heavy step forward, causing Jerome to snatch his hand back in sheer terror. He looked up at me from the floor, his face contorted in agony. He was completely abandoning the tough love father act and diving straight into desperate negotiations. "I will make you a full partner, Aaliyah," he blurted out, spit flying from his trembling lips. "We can rebrand the depot. You can have 50% ownership. You are smarter than all of us combined. I see that now. I will give you Jasmine's inheritance. Every single asset that was supposed to go to her, I will sign it directly over to you. Just please do not take the company." Across the room, Jasmine let out a strangled sob of pure disbelief. She struggled weakly against the security guard, staring at the man who had favored her since birth. Her own father was casually tossing her financial future into the fire just to save his own skin. Yolanda sat entirely paralyzed, her face a frozen mask of horror as she watched her husband strip away the last shreds of their family dignity. Jerome ignored his crying golden child completely. He stayed on his knees, staring up at me with wide, pleading eyes, waiting for me to accept his grand gesture. He genuinely believed that offering me a piece of his rotting empire would magically heal decades of relentless psychological abuse. He thought I still craved a seat at his table. I looked down at the pathetic, sweating man trembling on the restaurant floor. The silence in the room stretched out tight and suffocating. I slowly pushed my chair back and stepped around the edge of the table, my heels sinking into the plush rug. I walked right up to him, stopping only when my shoes were inches from his kneeling knees. I leaned down slowly, letting my shadow fall entirely over his face. "I do not want a partnership with a failing company." "Jerome," I said, keeping my voice perfectly soft and lethal, "I want you to sign the complete liquidation over to me. Now." I reached back into my leather briefcase and withdrew a crisp stack of legal documents. I dropped them onto the table right in front of Jerome's kneeling form. The bold black letters at the top clearly stated unconditional surrender of assets and immediate corporate liquidation. I tossed an expensive gold pen on top of the stack. The heavy metallic clink echoed in the silent room. "Sign it," I commanded. "Sign over every truck, every warehouse, every single corporate account directly to Apex Holdings." Across the room, Connor suddenly stopped struggling against the security guard holding him down. His face went completely pale as his eyes locked onto the title of the document. A realization of pure, absolute horror washed over his features. If Jerome signed those liquidation papers, the trucking depot would officially cease to exist as a viable corporate entity. That depot was the exact collateral Connor had illegally leveraged to secure his fraudulent venture capital loans. If Apex Holdings absorbed and liquidated Jerome's assets, Connor's fake collateral would instantly vanish into thin air. His entire federal defense strategy depended on that collateral. Without it, his prison sentence was a completely guaranteed certainty. "Do not sign that," Jerome Connor screamed, his voice cracking with absolute panic. He fought wildly against the massive security guard pinning him to the chair. "If you sign that document, we all go down. You cannot let her take the depot, Jerome. You promised me you would protect the assets. I need that company intact to leverage my legal defense. Do not let her win." Jerome froze his hand, hovering just inches above the gold pen. He slowly turned his head to look at his white son-in-law. The thick fog of panic in Jerome's eyes was suddenly pierced by a sharp, blinding flash of clarity. He finally understood the depth of Connor's betrayal. Connor had never cared about saving the Washington family legacy. Connor had only cared about using Jerome's crumbling business as a human shield to protect himself from a federal prison sentence. The man who had promised to elevate the Washington family to elite social status had actually been dragging them all down into a criminal abyss. The last remaining shred of Jerome's sanity completely snapped. The proud, arrogant patriarch, who demanded absolute control over everything, let out a guttural roar of pure animalistic rage. He scrambled up from the floor, moving with a speed that shocked everyone in the room. Before my security guards could even react, Jerome lunged across the dining table, sending crystal wine glasses and expensive silverware crashing to the floor. He grabbed Connor by the collar of his tailored shirt and delivered a brutal, sickening punch directly to Connor's face. The loud crack of bone echoed through the room as blood instantly spurted from Connor's nose. "You promised you would save me?" Jerome screamed, spraying saliva across Connor's face. He pulled back his fist and hit his son-in-law again. "You told me you were a genius. You said you were going to make us untouchable. You ruined us. You ruined my company and you ruined my life." Connor slumped backward in his chair, stunned and bleeding heavily, while Jerome kept screaming and shaking him. Jasmine let out a horrifying shriek, sobbing hysterically as she watched her father assault her husband. Yolanda remained completely frozen in her chair, unable to process the absolute violent implosion of her perfect family. I sat perfectly still in the CEO's chair, watching the entire scene unfold with cold detachment. I did not have to lift a single finger. The family that had spent decades trying to destroy me was now viciously tearing each other apart. My private security guards quickly stepped in, pulling Jerome off the bleeding venture capitalist and shoving the older man back toward the head of the table. Jerome was panting heavily, his expensive suit torn and covered in Connor's blood. He looked around the ruined dining room, at his sobbing daughter, his paralyzed wife, and his bleeding son-in-law. The illusion of the Washington family empire was completely dead. Jerome slowly turned back to me. His eyes were vacant and totally hollow. He sank back down to his knees, the fight completely drained from his body. Tears began to stream down his face, mixing with the sweat on his cheeks. He picked up the gold pen with a trembling hand. He did not say another word as he pressed the pen to the paper and began to sign his name on every single page of the liquidation agreement. He wept openly as he legally signed away his entire life to the daughter he had treated like absolute garbage. When he finished the last signature, the pen slipped from his fingers and rolled off the table. I calmly reached forward and pulled the stack of documents toward me. I tapped the edges against the mahogany table, ensuring they were perfectly aligned before sliding them back into my leather briefcase. I looked down at Jerome, who was still sobbing quietly on the floor. "Thank you," I said, my voice echoing in the ruined room. "The bulldozers will be at your depot at 8 a.m. tomorrow." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute and suffocating. The reality of my words finally pierced through the thick armor of Jerome's towering ego. The proud, arrogant man who had ruled our family through fear and financial manipulation began to physically crumble before my eyes. He stared at the federal indictment resting in front of Connor, and then his eyes slowly shifted back to me. The reality of his own ruined empire finally settled into his bones. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down his forehead and soaked into the expensive collar of his custom suit. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He tried to speak, but his voice was completely gone, leaving only a pathetic stuttering sound in the quiet dining room. He opened and closed his mouth like a suffocating fish. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white as he gasped for air. The man who had terrorized me for my entire childhood was now visibly shaking in his expensive leather shoes. "Aaliyah!" He finally choked out, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "You cannot do this to me. I am your father. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe me respect. You cannot just walk in here and destroy your own blood. We are family." I felt absolutely nothing as he played his ultimate guilt card. His desperate plea hung in the air, pathetic and hollow. It was almost comical how quickly he abandoned his ruthless corporate persona the second he realized he had lost. He was begging the daughter he had thrown away like trash. I reached back into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a glossy 8x10 photograph. It was a picture I had saved for years, keeping it perfectly preserved, waiting for this exact moment to arrive. The image showed the front lawn of the family estate on a bright, sunny afternoon. Draped across the pristine front porch was a massive custom banner that read, "Goodbye, Freeloader," in bold red letters. It was the banner Jerome had proudly hung the day he kicked me out with nothing but a garbage bag of my clothes. I remembered that day with crystal clarity. I remembered the neighbors pointing and laughing. I remembered the feeling of total, absolute rejection. I looked at the photograph for a brief second, and then I slid it slowly down the length of the long, polished table. It glided smoothly across the wood and came to a dead stop right next to his shaking hands. He looked down at the image, and the remaining color completely drained from his face. He recognized the banner immediately. He remembered the cruelty of that day just as clearly as I did. "You threw a lavish party to celebrate my homelessness, Jerome," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and icy. My words cut through the room with lethal precision. "You invited the entire neighborhood to laugh at your own daughter being thrown out into the street. You stood under that banner and told everyone I was a worthless parasite who would never amount to anything. You toasted to my failure while I walked to a bus stop with my entire life in a trash bag." I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table and looking directly into his terrified, wide eyes. "Now I am throwing a private party to celebrate your absolute bankruptcy." The sound of a chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor broke the heavy silence. Jasmine let out a feral scream of absolute rage. Her perfect socialite facade completely vanished as the reality of losing her house and her status finally registered in her shallow mind. She could not process the fact that she was no longer the golden child sitting on top of the world. She grabbed her heavy crystal wine glass from the table, her fingers wrapping tightly around the delicate stem. She lunged forward, her arm pulling back to hurl the expensive dark red wine directly at my face. She called me a monster and shrieked that I was destroying her perfect life out of pure jealousy. She screamed that I would always be nothing but a pathetic loser trying to ruin their happiness. Before the glass could even leave her hand, the heavy oak doors behind me burst open. My private security team moved with terrifying speed and precision. Two massive men in dark tailored suits crossed the private dining room in a fraction of a second. One of them clamped his large hand onto Jasmine's wrist, twisting it firmly downward and forcing her back into her seat, while the dark wine spilled harmlessly across the pristine white tablecloth. The dark red stain spread quickly, soaking into the fabric like fresh blood. Jasmine gasped in shock as the guard easily overpowered her, locking her arm against the armrest of her chair. At the exact same moment, Connor tried to jump up from his chair to defend his wife, or perhaps to attack me. His arrogant smirk was gone completely, replaced by the frantic energy of a trapped animal. The other security guard stepped directly behind him and shoved his massive hands down onto Connor's shoulders, pinning him brutally to the heavy leather chair. Connor let out a sharp gasp as the breath was knocked out of him. He struggled weakly, but the guard applied more pressure, locking him completely in place. My family was totally trapped and entirely at my mercy. Jasmine was sobbing hysterically, struggling against the iron grip of the security guard, while the spilled wine dripped onto her expensive designer dress. She looked like a spoiled child throwing a temper tantrum that no one cared about. Connor was paralyzed, hyperventilating, as he stared at the federal indictment that guaranteed his future behind bars. The realization that his fraudulent schemes had finally caught up to him was written clearly across his sweating face. Yolanda sat entirely frozen in her chair, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Her eyes darted between her crying golden child, her arrested son-in-law, and the broken man she had married. She had spent her entire life enabling their cruelty, and now she was forced to watch the consequences rip them all apart. I sat perfectly still in the CEO's chair, watching the chaos unfold with absolute cold detachment. My security guards stood like silent statues, holding my sister and her husband down with effortless strength. Jerome remained slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the photograph of the Goodbye Freeloader banner. His chest heaved as he struggled to breathe, the reality of his total defeat suffocating him. I did not have to raise my voice or lift a single finger. The empire built on cruelty and arrogance was completely demolished, and I was the one holding the sledgehammer. The heavy silence in the room was finally broken by the sound of Jerome's ragged, uneven breathing. The brutal reality of my words crashed down on him, completely shattering his towering ego and his delusions of grandeur. The proud, arrogant man who had ruthlessly ruled our family through fear and financial manipulation began to physically crumble right before my eyes. Heavy beads of sweat rolled down his forehead and soaked into the expensive collar of his custom-tailored suit. He tried to speak, to issue another one of his booming commands, but his voice was completely gone. It left only a pathetic stuttering sound echoing in the quiet private dining room. He gripped the edge of the polished mahogany table so hard that his knuckles turned bone white as he literally gasped for air. Aaliyah. He finally choked out, his voice cracking with a sickening level of absolute desperation. You cannot do this to me. You cannot destroy your own family. I am your father. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head and fed you for 18 years. You owe me respect. I sat perfectly still in the CEO's chair, feeling absolutely nothing as he played his ultimate pathetic guilt card. He had spent my entire life making sure I knew I was an unwanted burden, and now he wanted to claim the sacred bond of fatherhood. I reached back into my sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a glossy 8x10 photograph. It was a picture I had carefully saved for years, patiently waiting for this exact moment of reckoning. The vibrant image showed the sprawling front lawn of the Washington family estate on a bright summer afternoon. Draped across the pristine white columns of the front porch was a massive custom-printed banner that read, "Goodbye Freeloader," in thick, bold red letters. It was the exact banner Jerome had proudly hung the day he kicked me out of the house, with nothing but a black plastic garbage bag holding my clothes. I placed the photograph on the polished wood and slid it slowly down the length of the long table. The glossy paper glided smoothly, stopping right next to Jerome's shaking hands. He stared down at the image of his own cruelty, and the last drop of color drained from his face. "You threw a lavish neighborhood party to celebrate my homelessness, Jerome," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and icy cold. "You invited the entire neighborhood and all your business associates to laugh at your own daughter being thrown out into the street. You made a public spectacle of my pain just to boost your own arrogant ego." I leaned back into the deep leather of the chair and folded my hands, resting them on the table. Now I am throwing a private party to celebrate your absolute bankruptcy. The sudden screech of a wooden chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor shattered the tension. Jasmine let out a feral, high-pitched scream of absolute rage. Her carefully crafted, perfect socialite facade completely vanished in an instant. Her face contorted into an ugly mask of pure hatred as she grabbed her heavy crystal wine glass. She lunged recklessly across the table, her arm pulling back to hurl the expensive dark red wine directly at my face. She called me a jealous monster and shrieked that I was deliberately destroying her perfect affluent life. Before the dark liquid could even leave the rim of her glass, the heavy oak doors behind me burst open. My private security team moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Two massive men in dark tailored suits crossed the private dining room in a fraction of a second. One of them clamped his large hand onto Jasmine's wrist, twisting it firmly but smoothly downward. He forced her violently thrashing body back into her seat, while the dark red wine spilled harmlessly across the pristine white tablecloth, bleeding into the fabric like a deep stain. The second guard stepped directly behind Connor, instantly pinning his shoulders down to the heavy leather chair the very moment he tried to jump up and intervene. The restaurant manager quietly closed the doors again, sealing us inside. My entire family was totally trapped, held down by force, and left entirely at my mercy. The morning air was crisp and cold when I pulled my car to a stop across the street from the Washington Family Trucking Depot. The digital clock on my dashboard read exactly 8 a.m. I rolled down the window and rested my arm against the door, letting the heavy diesel exhaust of the heavy machinery wash over me. A massive yellow bulldozer raised its steel arm and drove straight into the main office building. The sound of tearing metal and shattering glass echoed across the empty asphalt lot. The large wooden sign that bore Jerome's name in arrogant gold lettering completely splintered into pieces under the weight of the tracks. It was buried in the dirt, just like the man who built it. I watched the destruction with a profound sense of peace. I was not just tearing down a ruined logistics company. The city had already approved my development permits. This massive plot of land was being completely cleared to build a state-of-the-art technology incubator. It would be a fully funded campus dedicated entirely to underprivileged minority youth. A safe haven for brilliant kids who were constantly told they were worthless and would never amount to anything. Kids who grew up just like me. The Washington family empire was completely reduced to rubble in a matter of hours. The fallout of that dinner crashed down on them with breathtaking speed. The federal authorities moved in on Connor 2 days later, raiding his office and freezing every single one of his personal accounts. He was indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate espionage. Facing a guaranteed decade in federal prison, his arrogance finally evaporated. Jasmine did not stand by her man. The moment the federal agents showed up and the bank foreclosed on her sprawling suburban mansion, she turned on him like a rabid dog. She filed for a viciously messy divorce, demanding alimony from a man who legally had zero assets left to his name. The perfect socialite was reduced to screaming at federal agents while they repossessed her luxury vehicle. She ended up moving into a cheap motel, completely broke and entirely alone. My parents faced an even more humiliating reality. Without the depot to leverage against his massive hidden debts, Jerome was forced into immediate catastrophic bankruptcy. The bank seized the family estate, the custom suits, the imported cars, and the antique furniture. Jerome and Yolanda were forced to pack whatever clothes they could fit into garbage bags and move into a tiny, run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The social isolation was absolute. For decades, my mother had ruled her high society church circle through gossip and intimidation. She had wielded her wealth like a weapon, looking down on anyone who could not afford expensive tithes and designer Sunday hats. The very first Sunday after their bankruptcy became public knowledge. Yolanda tried to walk into the church sanctuary. The usher quietly stopped her at the door and suggested she find another congregation. Their former friends completely turned their backs. The elite social circle they had sacrificed my entire childhood to impress dropped them without a second thought. Jerome became a hollow shell of a man, spending his days sitting on a stained thrift store couch in a dingy apartment, staring at a blank wall. I sat in my car watching the dust settle over the construction site. My phone began to vibrate in the center console. The screen lit up displaying Uncle Tyrone's name. He was the ultimate family opportunist, the man who had spent his entire life laughing at Jerome's cruel jokes while drinking his expensive liquor. I stood up slowly from the leather executive chair, retrieving my briefcase, which now held the signed complete liquidation of Jerome Washington Logistics. My security detail released Connor and Jasmine, whose shock and rage had given way to utter despair. Jasmine was hysterical, her sobs tearing through the silence of the opulent dining room stained now with wine and Connor's blood. Connor, clutching his broken nose, was paralyzed, staring at the federal indictment that guaranteed his future behind bars. Yolanda, the architect of the family's social facade, simply looked like a broken doll, her eyes vacant and fixed on her shattered husband on the floor. I didn't offer a parting word of advice or a final taunt. I simply nodded to my security team, turned, and walked out of the wreckage I had created. The entire Washington family was left exactly where they deserved to be, utterly alone and facing the absolute ruin of their entire lives. The following mornings, I was back in my penthouse office watching the city wake up. At exactly 8 a.m., my corporate real estate team executed the final phase of the liquidation. I had the live drone feed of the trucking depot projected onto the massive screen behind my desk. The sun glinted off the yellow paint of the bulldozers as they crashed through the massive steel gates that Jerome had always guarded with such desperate pride. The building that housed the dispatch office, the same one Jerome had mortgaged and leveraged to impress Connor, was the first to be reduced to rubble. The heavy metal sign bearing the Jerome Washington Logistics name, which he had proudly maintained for decades, splintered into meaningless pieces beneath the bulldozer's tracks. The land was being completely cleared to build the Apex Technology Incubator, a safe haven for brilliant, underprivileged minority youth, the kind of children my family would have instantly dismissed as worthless. The sight of the demolition was not just revenge. It was the foundation being cleared for a future they could never touch. The ripple effect of that dinner was immediate and devastating. The federal authorities moved in on Connor 2 days later. The FBI raided his office, seizing computers and freezing every one of his personal accounts. Facing a guaranteed decade in federal prison for wire fraud and corporate espionage, his arrogance finally evaporated. Jasmine didn't stand by her golden boy. The moment the federal agents showed up at their suburban mansion and the bank formally foreclosed on her house, she turned on him like a rabid animal. She filed for a viciously messy divorce, demanding alimony from a man who legally had zero assets left to his name. She spent an afternoon screaming at the federal agents while they repossessed her luxury SUV, claiming they were destroying the life she had earned. Her carefully constructed world of designer clothes and false wealth disintegrated, leaving her completely broke and entirely alone. She ended up moving into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, trading her perfect suburban life for a stained carpet and the humiliation of a public fall. The humiliation for my parents was equally absolute, but centered on their social standing. Yolanda, who had spent her entire life using the church community as a stage for her perfection, was the most affected. She couldn't fathom a life without the approval of her wealthy friends. The very first Sunday after their bankruptcy became public knowledge, Yolanda tried to walk into the sanctuary. She wore her lavender dress and wide-brimmed hat, trying to project the image of a woman simply enduring a temporary setback. But the gossip had already spread like wildfire. The usher, a man who had served the Washington family for 30 years, quietly stopped her at the oak door and suggested she find another congregation. He explained that a disgraced family could not remain in such a prominent role, implying they had brought shame to the sanctuary. The church, the centerpiece of Yolanda's social universe, dropped her without a second thought. Their former friends completely turned their backs, leaving her with no one to impress and nowhere to display her imagined superiority. Jerome's collapse was complete. Without the depot to leverage against his massive hidden debts, he was forced into catastrophic personal bankruptcy. The bank seized the family estate, the house where they had thrown the goodbye freeloader party, the custom suits, the imported cars, and the antique furniture. Jerome and Yolanda were forced to pack whatever clothes they could fit into garbage bags and move into a tiny, rundown one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. Jerome became a hollow shell of a man, spending his days sitting on a stained thrift store couch in a dingy apartment staring at a blank wall. He was physically present, but the proud patriarch had died the moment he signed those liquidation papers. A month later, I received a call